The Keth Sovereignty had a philosophy about leverage. It was not a complicated philosophy. It did not need to be. In 400 years of interstellar politics, the Keth had discovered that the most efficient way to control a more powerful opponent was not to match their strength. It was to hold something they could not afford to lose. Hostages. Not soldiers, not infrastructure, not territory. People. Civilians, scientists, diplomats, children when the situation required a particularly strong signal. The Keth had refined the practice into something approaching an art form. They had used it against the Vorian collective 17 diplomats held for 6 years, extracting trade route concessions worth more than a military campaign. They had used it against the Shal Federation, 40 researchers aboard a seized station, resulting in a technology transfer that had advanced Keth weapons development by 2 decades. They had used it against 8 other civilizations in the last century alone, and in every case the calculation had worked. You hold what they love, they give you what you want. It was elegant, it was low cost, it was effective. The Keth Sovereignty's Expansion Council had reviewed the file on humanity for 3 years before deciding to apply the strategy. The review was thorough by their standards. They had studied the Sol engagement of 2387, had noted humanity's demonstrated military capability with appropriate caution, and had concluded that a direct military confrontation was inadvisable. But nobody had said anything about leverage. The opportunity came in 2401, 14 years after the Sol engagement. A human deep space research convoy, 7 vessels carrying 412 scientists, engineers, and support staff, was conducting survey operations in the Vela Expanse, a disputed transit region approximately 60 light-years from the nearest human military installation. The convoy was civilian. It was unarmed. It was operating under the joint research mandate of the United Earth Science Directorate, cataloging stellar phenomena in a region that no major power had formally claimed. The Keth Sovereignty had formally claimed it the previous year. The claim was not internationally recognized. It did not need to be. The Keth had physical presence in the region, 3 patrol cruisers, each one capable of stopping a civilian convoy without difficulty. The convoy was stopped. The 412 humans aboard were transferred to a Keth holding facility on a station they called Meridian Point, 42 light-years from Earth, and a communication was dispatched to the United Earth Assembly. The communication contained the standard leverage package, a list of demands, a deadline, a carefully worded statement about the health and welfare of the detained personnel designed to make clear that their continued well-being was contingent on compliance. It also contained a strategic assessment the Keth Sovereignty was very proud of. They had done the math, 412 lives, against a military response that would require moving assets across 60 light-years of contested space, against the risk of an engagement that would escalate beyond what either side could comfortably manage. The Keth were not asking for territory or military concession. They were asking for transit rights through the Vela Expanse and a reduction in human survey operations in the region. Modest demands, low cost to meet, high cost to refuse. The United Earth Assembly would deliberate for a few weeks, as democratic institutions did. They would conclude that the welfare of 412 people outweighed the political cost of the concessions. They would comply. The Keth Sovereignty's Expansion Council approved the operation by unanimous vote. The deadline was set at 45 days. They did not expect a response on day 2. The response came 41 hours after the Keth communication was received on Earth. It was not what the Keth expected. The expected response was an acknowledgement of receipt, a request for proof of life, and the beginning of a negotiation timeline. This was the standard pattern. Every civilization the Keth had leveraged had followed it within the first 72 hours. The pattern was reliable because it was rational. You received a demand. You verified the demand was real. You began the process of determining how much compliance would cost. What the Keth Sovereignty received instead was a single-line communication from the Office of the United Earth Defense Command. It read, "Personnel recovery operation is underway. No negotiation will occur. Ensure the welfare of all 412 individuals. This communication will not be repeated." The Keth Expansion Council reviewed the message in committee. The senior counselor, a strategist named Vela who had overseen 7 successful leverage operations, read it 3 times. "They are bluffing," she said. "This was Tayage." Irrational conclusion. The nearest human military installation was 60 light-years away. Even at maximum drive output, a military response force would require weeks to reach the Vela Expanse. The 45-day deadline was designed to expire before any physical response could arrive, forcing a decision through the assembly before military options became relevant. "Confirm the holding facility's defensive status," Veleth ordered. The report came back within the hour. Meridian Point was a Keth commercial station retrofitted as a detention facility. Its defensive complement included 12 patrol cruisers, 6 defensive gun platforms, and a complement of 2,000 Keth security personnel. It was not a military fortress, but against whatever humanity could assemble and move to the Vela Expanse in 45 days, it was more than sufficient. "Prepare a counter-communication," Veleth said. "Acknowledge their response. Remind them of the deadline. Do not escalate the tone." She was experienced enough to know that the first phase of every leverage operation involved some display of resolve from the target. It meant nothing. In 6 weeks, the assembly would calculate the same numbers the Keth had already calculated, reach the same conclusions, and send a compliance team. They always did. The counter-communication was drafted and sent. No reply came. On day 4, Keth long-range sensors in the Vela Expanse detected an anomaly. A gravitational fluctuation, consistent with jump drive emergence, at a distance of approximately 12 light-hours from Meridian Point. The sensors recorded the size of the emergent signature. The duty officer who received the report checked the readings twice, and then called his commanding officer. The commanding officer checked the readings 3 times and called Meridian Point Station Command. Station Command called the Keth Sovereignty Military Directorate. The Military Directorate called the Expansion Council. Veleth looked at the sensor data for a long time before she spoke. "That cannot be correct," she said. The sensor analyst on the channel confirmed that the readings had been verified against 3 independent arrays. The emergent signature was consistent with a fleet. Not a task force, not a rapid response unit, a fleet. 41 hours after the Keth communication had been received on Earth, humanity had somehow put a fleet of warships in the Vela Expanse. 60 light-years away. In 41 hours. The physics were not impossible. That was the first thing the Keth Military Directorate established, because the first instinct was to call it impossible and dismiss the sensors as malfunctioning. But the sensors were not malfunctioning. The physics were not impossible. They were merely extreme. Standard jump drive technology, the kind used by every major civilization in the known galaxy, including the Keth, required careful drive calculations, gradient mapping, and a warm-up cycle that averaged between 4 and 9 hours depending on drive class. The resulting jump could cover, at maximum safe range, approximately 20 light-years per transit. 3 transits, with the associated recalculation and warm-up periods. To cover 60 light-years would require a minimum of 38 hours for a single warship with an optimized crew. For a fleet, the coordination overhead brought that number closer to 70 hours. The Keth had done this math before issuing the ultimatum. It was part of the calculation. 60 light-years, 45 days, one response window in which the assembly would face its deadline before a physical response was possible. 41 hours. The Keth analysts revised the calculation 17 times. The math kept coming back to the same answer. A human fleet could not be at the coordinates the sensors were showing in 41 hours unless one of two things was true. Either the ships had already been in transit when the ultimatum was delivered, meaning humanity had known about the operation before the Keth executed it, which was a level of intelligence penetration that made Vela's hands go cold. Or human jump drive technology operated at parameters that made the Keth's entire strategic assessment obsolete. The Keth Military Directorate requested an immediate analysis from their intelligence division. The intelligence division's report came back in 6 hours. It said both things were probably true. The first element, prepositioning, was supported by signals intelligence suggesting that human deep space military assets had begun moving toward the Vela Expanse region approximately 8 days before the convoy was intercepted. Not in response to the interception, before it. The timing was consistent with humanity having detected the Keth patrol cruisers moving into intercept position and having begun their own response before the leverage operation was even executed. The convoy had not been a target of opportunity. It had been bait. The second element. Drive technology was harder to confirm but supported by the emergent signature data. The gravitational profile of a jump emergence was directly related to drive output and transit velocity. The Keth analysts had classified it as a large fleet because of the size of the signature. But when they ran the profile against known drive parameters, the signature was not consistent with a large fleet operating at normal velocities. It was consistent with a moderate fleet operating at velocities the Keth had no reference data for. Human jump drives, based on available intelligence, were faster than Keth standard by a factor that the Directorate's analysts argued about for 2 hours before settling on a conservative estimate. The conservative estimate was a factor of 3. Vela read the intelligence report in silence. She thought about the Sol engagement of 2387. She thought about the probe that humanity had detected in 2346 and had said nothing about for 41 years while they built. She thought about a species that had watched the Keth move patrol cruisers into the Vela Expanse and had said nothing, done nothing visible, and had quietly begun moving ships. How many, she asked. We are still counting emergent signatures, the sensor analyst said. Current estimate is between 200 and 250 warships. Meridian Point had 12 patrol cruisers. They are not going to negotiate, Vela said. It was the first time in her career that she had said those words about a leveraged target. Counselor, her military advisor, said carefully, if they attempt a direct assault on Meridian Point, the hostages. I know, she said. She knew a direct assault on a holding facility in the history of every leverage operation the Keth had ever conducted had never happened. It had never happened because every civilization with hostages in a leverage situation understood the fundamental arithmetic. The value of compliance was always less than the cost of an assault that might kill the very people it was meant to recover. It was the architecture of the leverage, the reason it worked. A fleet outside your door meant nothing if attacking would kill your own people inside. Vela had used this architecture 7 times. It had never failed. Prepare a communication, she said. Extend the deadline, reduce the demands, give them something to negotiate with, move the goal posts closer to them. She was not afraid yet. She was still thinking like a strategist. By the end of the day, she would be afraid. The file was called Operation Homebound. It had been written in 2389, 2 years after the Sol engagement, by a planning team inside the United Earth Defense Command Special Recovery Division. The division had been created specifically in response to an analysis of Keth Sovereignty behavior patterns, which the UEDC's intelligence arm had been monitoring for a decade before the Sol engagement made humanity's military capability a matter of public galactic record. The analysis had concluded something straightforward. The Keth would try leverage. It was not a guess. It was an assessment built on a complete behavioral profile of the sovereignty's diplomatic and military history. The Keth had used hostage leverage 11 times in 4 centuries against 9 different civilizations with a success rate of 100%. They were very good at it. They had refined the technique to the point where it operated almost automatically. A script that played out the same way every time because every civilization that faced it did the same math and reached the same conclusion. The UEDC planning team had decided that humanity would not do the same math. Or rather, humanity would do different math entirely. Operation Homebound was based on a principle that the planning team had labeled in the formal document as unacceptable precedent. The principle was simple. If humanity was known to negotiate with hostage takers, humanity would always have hostages taken. The cost of establishing once and completely that humanity did not negotiate, that the leverage architecture simply did not function against them, was measurable and finite. The cost of never establishing it was infinite. 412 people were a terrible price. The planning team had written that explicitly in the document. They had not minimized it or hidden it in strategic language. They had written, 412 lives are a terrible price and this plan does not guarantee their recovery. This plan prioritizes the principle over the outcome because the outcome serves only 412 people, while the principle, once established, serves 11 billion. The document had been signed off by 3 successive defense secretaries. It had never been made public. What had been made public, quietly, in the kind of policy statement that governments release when they want something known without wanting it discussed, was a single line in the United Earth Defense Command's official doctrine of operations, published in 2391. The United Earth Assembly does not negotiate the release of detained personnel. Recovery operations will be conducted by the appropriate military authority. Nobody had tested it yet. Until 2401. The convoy in the Vela Expanse had not been a random selection. The UEDC's intelligence division had identified the Keth patrol cruisers repositioning into intercept range 8 days before the interception occurred and had assessed the likely target. The convoy's route took it through the area the Keth had informally claimed. It was a civilian convoy, unarmed, exactly the profile the Keth preferred for leverage operations. The UEDC had not redirected the convoy. They had accelerated it. They had moved the convoy into the intercept zone on a schedule that maximized the Keth's operational comfort. That made the leverage operation look easy, obvious, low risk. They had ensured the convoy was carrying the kind of personnel that would maximize the emotional weight of the leverage calculation. Scientists, researchers, people with names and families and ongoing projects that made them individually visible rather than statistically abstract. They had made the bait as attractive as possible. And they had begun moving the fleet 8 days before the Keth made their move. The fleet was already in transit when the Keth communication reached Earth. The 41-hour response time was real. 41 hours was how long it took for the communication to arrive and for the formal authorization to be sent. But the ships were already moving, had been moving for 8 days. Admiral Kira Tan, commanding the recovery force from the bridge of the UES Immovable, had been in transit for 8 days when the authorization came through. Her fleet completed its final jump into the Vela Expanse 33 hours after leaving the last waypoint. The emergent signature that had appeared on Keth sensors 41 hours after Earth received the ultimatum was real. What the Keth sensors had not detected, because they were positioned to monitor the space around Meridian Point, not the station's interior structural systems, was the second element of Operation Homebound, the one that had been in place for 3 years. Meridian Point was a commercial station. Commercial stations had supply chains, they had maintenance contracts, they had rotating crews of technical specialists who serviced their environmental systems, their power distribution networks, their communications arrays. They had vendor relationships with dozens of companies across multiple systems, none of which were individually notable or worth investigating. One of those companies was a logistics firm called Vela Transit Solutions, incorporated in the neutral commerce zone of the Expanse in 2398. Its principal business was supply delivery to remote stations in the region. It had contracts with 7 stations, including Meridian Point. Its crews rotated through those stations on a regular schedule. They were unremarkable. They were background. They were UADC special operations. The Vela Transit Solutions contract with Meridian Point had been in place for 2 years. In that time, its personnel had serviced the station's environmental control systems 4 times, its power distribution network 3 times, and its communications array twice. They were competent, professional, and entirely invisible. They were also, during each service rotation, conducting a thorough survey of the station's layout, security systems, detention facility location, guard rotations, access protocols, and structural vulnerabilities. When the convoy was intercepted and the 412 humans were brought aboard Meridian Point, 12 UEDC operators were already on the station. They had been there for 9 days, on a scheduled maintenance rotation that had been carefully timed to coincide with the window when the UEDC's intelligence assessment suggested the Keth would execute their leverage operation. 12 people inside a station with 2,000 security personnel. They did not attempt to free the hostages. They did what they had been trained for. They mapped the detention facility's exact configuration. They identified the location of every hostage. They placed microtransmitters, passive, undetectable, activated only by a specific coded signal, on the environmental control access panels nearest to the detention zone. And they waited. The signal would come from Admiral Tan's fleet. When it did, the 12 operators had 47 seconds to execute their phase of the operation. The microtransmitters would send a pulse through the environmental control network that would seal the detention zone's internal bulkheads, designed as emergency pressure containment, but equally effective at compartmentalizing a security response. The operators would neutralize the guards in the detention sector, using equipment that had been brought aboard in pieces across 3 separate maintenance rotations and assembled quietly in the station's maintenance tunnels over the past 9 days. In 47 seconds, the detention zone would be a sealed, secured compartment with 412 humans inside and 12 UEDC operators holding the perimeter. And then Admiral Tan's fleet would have a clean target. The Keth on Meridian Point had 2,000 security personnel, 12 patrol cruisers, and 6 gun platforms. The UEDC had 230 warships outside and 12 operators inside. The math was different from what Velith had calculated. Admiral Tan opened the channel to Meridian Point at 300 hours, Vela Expanse standard. She had timed it deliberately. 300 was the quietest shift rotation on any station. The personnel on duty were the late watch crews, statistically the least senior, the most fatigued. The senior command staff was off shift. decision cycles would be slower. Every second of decision cycle delay was operationally valuable. Meridian Point, she said. This is Admiral Kira Tan of the United Earth Defense Command. I am transmitting on an open channel and I will speak plainly. You have 412 of my people aboard your station. I have 230 warships positioned at engagement range. I am not going to negotiate. I am not going to wait for your command staff to wake up and make decisions. You have 12 minutes to begin the process of returning my people to the shuttle bay on Deck 7. If that process has not begun in 12 minutes, I will begin mine. As she closed the channel, her tactical officer looked at her. They'll stall. They'll try, she said, run the countdown. The channel opened again in 40 seconds. A Keth duty officer, voice controlled but with an edge in it that Tan had heard before and recognized. The edge of someone who knew their situation was worse than their orders accounted for. Admiral Tan, this is Meridian Point Station Command. Your transmission has been received. We are connecting you to the Keth Sovereignty Diplomatic Office to begin. I said I'm not negotiating, Tan said. I don't need a diplomatic office. I need Deck 7 Shuttle Bay in 11 minutes and 20 seconds. She closed the channel again. Her operations officer spoke quietly from the secondary console. 12 operators report ready, transmitters placed. Estimate 38 seconds to detention zone control from signal. Tan nodded. The Keth channel opened a third time. A different voice. Senior, this one. Controlled in a different way, the control of someone who had experience and was using it to manage a situation that had moved outside their model. Admiral Tan, I am Station Commander Orith. I understand your position. However, you must understand that any military action against this station places our guests at significant risk. We have security protocols that... Commander Orith, Tan said, I know the layout of your detention facility. I know where every one of my people is. I know the shift rotation of your security personnel. I know the location of your environmental control access panels. She paused. I know that your weapon systems have a targeting cycle of 9 seconds from cold activation. My weapon systems do not have a targeting cycle. They are already active. Another pause, 10 minutes. Silence on the channel. Then, how do you know the layout of our facility? Because I planned for this, she said, the same way I plan for everything. She could hear the shift in the silence. The quality of it changed. There was a moment, she had experienced it before in other situations, across a career built on the logic of overwhelming preparation, where the other side realized that the problem they were facing was not the problem they had prepared for. Orith was a competent station commander. He had prepared for a standoff. He had prepared for threats and counter-threats and the slow diplomatic ballet of a leveraged situation resolving through political channels. He had not prepared for an opponent who had been planning this specific operation for 2 years, who had people inside his station, who knew his facility better than most of his own staff did. You have 9 minutes, Tan said. She sent the activation signal to the micro-transmitters. 38 seconds later, her operations officer confirmed, detention zone is sealed, operators in position, 412 personnel accounted for, all alive. Tan let out 1 breath. A shuttle bay authorization, she said. Her communications officer flagged an incoming transmission. Meridian Point is opening the bay. She gave Orith 2 minutes to begin the transfer before she came back on the channel. I see your bay doors are open. I am sending 3 shuttle teams. My operators will escort my people to the shuttles. Your security personnel will stand down in the detention sec. Tor, if they do not stand down, my operators are authorized to ensure that they do. No responses. I'll take the silence as agreement, she said. The transfer took 31 minutes. 412 people moving through Meridian Point's corridors under UEDC escort, onto shuttles lifting off from Deck 7 and crossing the distance to the recovery fleet in groups of 40. Each group's arrival was confirmed and logged. Medical teams met each shuttle. Every name on the manifest was checked against a living face. It took 31 minutes. Not one person was harmed. When the last shuttle cleared the bay and the doors closed, Tan opened the channel to Meridian Point one final time. "Commander Orith," she said, "your station is intact. Your personnel are unharmed. I am withdrawing my fleet. I want you to understand something clearly because I want you to report it accurately to the Keth Sovereignty Expansion Council." Pause. "We were not here because of your demands. We were here because those are our people. There is no calculation you can make, no leverage you can design, no operation you can construct where the outcome is different from this. We will always come. We will always find them. We will always bring them home." She let that settle. "Do not take our people again." She closed the channel. The Keth Sovereignty's Expansion Council convened 4 days after the Meridian Point incident. Councillor Velith submitted her report. It was the first after-action report she had ever written for a failed leverage operation. The experience of writing it was clarifying in a way she had not anticipated. She had spent 40 years in Keth strategic service. She had overseen leverage operations that had bent the trajectory of interstellar politics, that had extracted resources and concessions from civilizations far larger than the Keth could have dominated militarily. She had believed in the architecture of leverage the way that engineers believed in mathematics. The architecture had failed. She wrote it plainly in the report. The architecture had failed because humanity had not engaged with it. Every previous target had engaged with it, had accepted the basic premise that the hostages were leverage, that leverage created pressure, that pressure created compliance. Humanity had treated the leverage as irrelevant, not because they did not value the lives of their people. They had moved 230 warships across 60 light-years in 8 days. They valued their people enormously. But they valued the principle more. She wrote that too. The target civilization does not permit the leverage architecture to function. They have pre-committed at an institutional level to non-negotiation and have built operational capacity sufficient to make that commitment credible. The leverage calculation assumes that the cost of compliance is lower than the cost of refusal. Against this target, the cost of compliance, the precedent it sets, the behavior it invites, has been institutionally assessed as infinite. There is no demand we can make that falls below the cost they have decided to pay. The Council reviewed the report. They reviewed the sensor data from the fleet emergence. They reviewed the timeline, 8 days of transit, 12 operators pre-positioned inside their station, a recovery plan that had clearly been in development for years before the leverage operation was even conceived. They reviewed the communications transcript, the 31-minute transfer, the 0 casualties. The senior counselor spoke first. They knew we were going to do this. Nobody disputed it. They planned for it before we planned for it. Nobody disputed that either. Velith had spent the 4 days since Meridian Point thinking about a particular detail in the after-action data. The micro-transmitters placed on the environmental control panels. She had reviewed the station maintenance logs. She knew which crew had placed them. She knew the company. She knew how long the contract had been in place. 2 years. The UADC had placed operators inside Meridian Point 2 years ago. The leverage operation had been planned by the Keth Council for 18 months. Humanity had been ready 4 months before the Keth had even decided to do it. She thought about the Sol engagement. She thought about the probe in 2346. She thought about 41 years of preparation and the fleet that had turned around. She thought about a civilization that had been listening to Verk victory broadcasts for 160 years before the Verk arrived and had spent that time building. She thought about patience as a doctrine. Not patience as waiting, patience as preparation. The distinction was critical and she had missed it entirely. The Keth Sovereignty had looked at humanity's post-Sol behavior and seen restraint, seen a civilization that had won one engagement and was not pushing its advantage, had interpreted the quiet as comfort, as a civilization that had proved its point and was content to hold its ground. She understood now that the quiet was not restraint. It was construction. Humanity was always building something, always preparing for the next version of the problem. They had planned for Verk aggression 41 years before it arrived. They had planned for Keth leverage operations before the Keth had identified them as a target. They were, right now, in the aftermath of Meridian Point, planning for whatever came next. Whatever came next. Vela set down her stylus. Remove them from the expansion list, she said. The council chamber was quiet. Remove them entirely, she said. Not reclassified, removed. We do not plan operations against humanity. We do not move assets near their survey corridors. We do not engage with their civilians, their convoys, their installations, their personnel. She looked around the table. We build a border, we maintain a distance, and we be grateful that we have the opportunity to make that choice before they make it for us. Nobody argued. The vote was unanimous. The 412 researchers returned to Earth aboard a convoy of UEDC recovery vessels. They arrived at a reception that was smaller than the size of the story might have warranted, no public ceremony, no broadcast address, no formal declaration. The UEDC's doctrine of operational security meant that the details of Operation Homebound remained classified. Most people on Earth knew only that their people had been taken and then returned. The how was not public. The why, the principle, the pre-commitment, the cost assessed as acceptable before the event occurred, was not something the government had ever made a speech about. There was no speech. There was a policy statement, updated in the UEDC Doctrine Archive 3 weeks after Meridian Point, in the same flat institutional language that the original statement had used. The original line had read, "The United Earth Assembly does not negotiate the release of detained personnel. Recovery operations will be conducted by the appropriate military authority." The updated line added 4 words. "The United Earth Assembly does not negotiate the release of detained personnel. Recovery operations will be conducted by the appropriate military authority. We will always arrive." In the years that followed, the Meridian Point operation circulated through galactic intelligence networks the way that the Sol engagement had circulated, gradually, incompletely, arriving at distant stations in fragments that receivers assembled into a picture. The picture was consistent. A leverage operation executed against humanity. Standard architecture, solid target selection, appropriate demands, every parameter had been correct. It had not worked. Not because of military imbalance. The Keth had known about the military imbalance and designed around it. It had not worked because the target did not function according to the leverage model. Because somewhere in their institutional history, humanity had made a decision that the model did not apply to them and had built the capacity to make that decision real. The civilizations that received the story and still had the ability to draw conclusions from it, the ones that had not yet passed through the Verk processing system, the ones still holding their own councils and making their own choices about what kind of species they wanted to be, filed it alongside the Sol engagement in whatever archives they maintained. Some of them began having different conversations. About doctrine, about pre-commitment, about the distance between restraint and preparation and why humanity seemed to have abolished that distance entirely. About what it meant that they were out there, this species with 11 billion people and a quiet that was not stillness, that was something else entirely. In a processing facility on a world the Verk called Labor Class 7, in a common area where people who no longer had their own names gathered during the rest cycle, someone had scratched 3 words into the wall beside a ventilation panel. The words had been scratched over other words, older words, words in a dozen languages that had belonged to 47 peoples who had seen the scouts and seen the diplomats and seen the fleet and had not had enough time. The new words were in no language that the Verk recognized. They were in English. 3 words scratched by someone who had received a fragment of a transmission. A partial account of a fleet arriving in the Vela Expanse 60 light-years from Earth in 41 hours to bring 412 people home. 3 words that meant something to someone who had once looked up at the stars and had had their hope taken away, and who was looking at those stars again through a ventilation grate for the first time in a long time. They always arrive. In the Sol system, the watch continued. The installations were maintained. Drone carriers held their station behind Jupiter's shadow. The deep system platforms rotated their crews on schedule. New systems came online. Old ones were upgraded. The quiet that looked like stillness and was not stillness continued in every direction, at every range, in every region of space where human interests touched the edge of the unknown. Admiral Tan submitted her after-action report and returned to her post. Oh, she did not give speeches. She gave briefings to the next generation of UEDC officers about the doctrine of Operation Homebound and the principle it had been built to establish. The briefings were classified. The officers who received them went on to plan the next operation, and the one after that, in the same spirit that the first planners had worked quietly, thoroughly, ahead of the problem. Always ahead of the problems. Somewhere in the classified archives of the United Earth Defense Command, in a file structure that had grown enormously since Project Threshold, there were folders named for potential scenarios that had not yet occurred. Situations that no other civilization had prepared for yet, because no other civilization planned at that distance in advance. The folders had names. The files inside them had dates. The dates were years away, some of them were decades away. All of them were fully staffed. Humanity did not wait for the problem to arrive. Humanity was already at the problem's destination. That was the thing that Velith had written in her report, and that the Keth Council had sat with in silence, and that the fragments of the story carried, imperfectly, across the distances to whoever was still out there and still watching. They did not react. They prepared. They did not hope. They arrived. And they were still here. They were always still here. Phase 7 complete. End of transmission.